Preservation's tricky. I'm not, and I think Miami, actually, the local preservationists, actually, I think we're all fairly aligned. It's not about, oh, you've got to save everything, right? I mean, there are buildings that are like, geez, the Bacardi building, right? That would be tragic if that was gone. And there, so there are these buildings and these moments. Miami is a young city. Listen, we're, 1908, 1909, we own the Miami River Inn. The charter was 1896. So we own the oldest hotel in Miami, and it's 5 wood vernacular houses. One by itself would mean nothing, but it's the collection of the 5. And it's what it represented, which was when Miami first started. Miami exists because of Flagler, because of the train and the port, and the combination of those two. And the Miami River Inn sort of captures that. So if you'd come to Miami and that would have been a boarding house where you would have stayed, if you were deciding whether to stay or to leave. And certainly the river in and of itself, holds a lot of history. One thing that happened through the process of doing the Vagabond, and on the boulevard, it is a standout, certainly architecturally significant. The same architect, Robert Swartberg, same architect that did the Delano. So it was kind of grand for a motel that, wasn't your typical pull in, pull out. When you think back to Miami mid-century, it's really tropical mid-century as opposed to this more like Palm Springs, not really like the Deco district on the beach, right? They're very different. And I think, but it captured that time. It was, yes, modest, but it captured that time. It was post-World War II. Yeah, everybody it was the car culture, the factories that were building tanks were now building cars. And it was a very optimistic, playful time. So this idea of the roadside diners and roadside motels, it spoke to, sort of what came next, the race to the moon, the Jetsonian. When you look at the details of the Vagabond, it's a throwback. We have lighting on the outside that look like car hubcaps, and the fins, for the porte cochere are like the back of a Cadillac. And, so it's not grand, and sometimes more form and function. But the one thing that I learned in doing the Vagabond, which I really underestimated, was the sort of the emotional impact. The Vagabond, or places where people lived, like these older hotels and stuff, captured memories. There are some things that are buildings and, they're interesting because they're institutions, but this was about people's lives. So I remember we were renovating it, and the Miami Herald came to do a story, and the woman that took the picture, saw the pool emptied out and the mermaid in the bottom of the pool. And she goes, this is where I learned how to swim on one of my staycations. And somebody else, we had the opening, and a mother came with her children and her grandchildren and said, this is where we landed when we came off the Cuban boats. And she was tearful. She goes, she lived there for 6 months. And she said, if only my husband could see it now. Another couple came, I was at the bar, and they, they're in their 80s. And she goes, we had our honeymoon there. And she goes, and it was that room over there. And she goes, and by the way, I was a virgin. So probably a little more information than I wanted, but I still get letters in the mail. Somebody recently had gone through, their parents had passed, and they went up to the attic and went through boxes. And she went to the trouble to send me one of the original brochures for the Vagabond, which was actually was a watercolor version. And she sent it to me. She goes, my parents spoke so fondly. It's, buildings in general, I mean, they're made of organic materials. They're not, this is not bricks and mortar. These are lives and lifestyles. And in preservation, I think people need to think more about what it represents, as opposed to just, the architecture itself. And sometimes the architecture could be the most important thing. Certainly there's an art in that, but the stories, capturing stories. I was saying preservation, how do you know where you're going if you don't know where you've been? And it's this idea of having context. So again, you're not supposed to save everything. And I don't, Miami most of us feel that way. And I think also when you do preservation, it's about making it relevant. I think one thing that we succeeded with Vagabond was we made it relevant. Like, you don't want to have this really beautiful moment or this story to tell and then nobody not go. And it's a story that's ongoing. So it was the story in the past, but now it's the new stories. So I think that, preservation, when done right, is a public benefit. It creates context, it creates texture. And I think it is part of community and really part of really our ideas of social resiliency, which is that the past and relationships and people and their stories matter. So unfortunately, there's people look at preservation sometimes and they see it as a liability, right? It's a constraint. Developers go, oh my God, I can't do this, I can't do that. I see constraints. I saw the constraint as actually a positive, because it's an asset. Because that means when you designate a neighborhood, that means the guy next to you has some design guidelines, right? They have an obligation to sort of maintain the integrity of the area. So in a way, it's kind of protection. Otherwise, somebody could knock down a building and build an ugly building or whatever. And obviously what's programmed inside is not restricted, but at least I have the protection that if I'm going to really make this investment and really support this, let's just say this moment in time, that other people around me will have to do the same. It's subjective, and there's good architects and designers, but I think, my job was to match the postcard, and to your point, to try to take it up a level. And I think that was important because, we sort of set the bar, and I think that helped other developers, push it as well. John Conkle did a beautiful job across the street and everything. So I think we set the bar. Yeah, I think, everybody goes, gosh, what were you thinking when you bought it? It's like, probably wasn't thinking. The question always is, like, how did you get there? And, the challenge was, this was a neighborhood where it was drugs and prostitution. You've been here long enough most people who've been here and lived here in the 50s and 60s would know. And certainly, who've been lucky enough to see it in 50s, 60s, saw the deterioration, which happened when they built 95 and everybody got off US 1. And that people couldn't see past it. They couldn't see the buildings. All they could see was the streetwalker. And so what made us think that, in a neighborhood where it was $20 an hour, $60 a night, that we could do a boutique hotel? Yeah, I think I have a lot of people that have followed me. In New York City, I used to do new neighborhoods and I used to do things that were, a little bit on the fringe, but I had a lot of the investment here was really myself, my partner and really close family and friends, because I just couldn't spreadsheet it. I just couldn't get it to work. It was definitely a passion project. But I had this idea that, remember, this was a street that once was, right? It wasn't like you can go into some neighborhoods, and we've done this where we create neighborhood. But this was a neighborhood. It had this story already. I didn't have to, in everything we do, it's always storytelling for us. And so the fact that it had a story, you already had affluent houses, right? To the east, you had, all the way from Bay Point up to Miami Shores. So in some instances, you're trying to, you're having to build neighborhood around it. And then in other instances like this, we were just dusting off something that once was. So in that regards, it wasn't as big a lift as it looked. The design was already there. I think it was more courage than anything. The hotel next door, the other thing that we realized was it couldn't just be the one hotel, because if you needed to buy 6 or 7 of these hotels where these things were going on, and though we didn't fix the social problem, at least we could stop the businesses that were going on there. And that once we shut down those hotels, the neighborhood changed quicker than I could have ever imagined. And so that's, you know, so we, like I said, it was probably more courage. I think a lot of people drove down that street and have admired certainly that property and a few others. We just finished the Gold Dust as well. But it was sort of the courage to believe that what was hidden, or just, let's say, covered, that when it was unmasked would sort of carry the day. And it did. So it was, you know, I always say with preservation, we're caretakers. You know, we're really the caretakers of these stories, and grateful to the people. I mean, it was really the work of Terry D'Amico and Ellen and all these Randolph and all these other people that actually went to the trouble to designate, because designation is a very, very arduous process. The fact that they went to the trouble to designate these 20 blocks, you know, I'm forever grateful. And it's really, a lot of credit goes to them. And then with the help of the city, it was actually, in order to take on the Vagabond. So preservation is more expensive than just building new, which is why a lot of people knock things down. It would have been cheaper for me to knock the building down and put it back. But in preservation, lookalikes don't count. If you lose a building in a storm, you're not supposed to put it back. You know, in fact, they want the juxtaposition, which is similar to what we did at Starbucks down the block. This idea of modern mixed with the mid-century to sort of highlight sort of those architectural details. And so, yeah, it was an interesting process. And, you know, in New York City, I came from New York City, where everything's historic, right? You deal with landmarks in every neighborhood. So, but it was, and I knew about it was those incentives that were put in place by Commissioner Sarnoff and with the help of Lucia from Greenberg, that really enabled us. Because without the historic incentives, we would not have been able to, it wouldn't be feasible. And so, you know, again, really grateful for what a lot of other people did to put us in a position where we could do, you know, something as marvelous. And you know, the fun thing about it is when you do really cool projects like that, you get a chance to work with really great people. You know, my friend Stefan DePoe does great interiors, wanting to help, and Terry D'Amico want to help, and the artists, people want to be part of it. That, you know, that's the other thing I think sometimes people underestimate.